in my last video, I looked back at the year 2023 and ranked my 10 favorite films, I of course also had to make another list this week, now swapping out positivity for negativity and ranking the 10 worst horror movies I saw this year. Just as I did last week, before I get into this year's 10, let's first remember my bottom 10 from 2022. I had Morbius, The Cellar, Mandrake, The Requiem, Firestarter, Dashcam, Grimcuddy, Halloween Ends, Jeepers Creepers Reborn, and Orphan First Kill. Alright, starting this new list, at number 10 is Insidious The Red Door. Including this on my list hurts me more than it hurts you. Insidious is one of my favorite horror franchises. I even highlighted this Insidious sequel in my video of most anticipated 2023 releases. I was very excited to see the Lambert family return and to see Patrick Wilson make his directorial debut. If I'm gonna say a single nice thing, this film did have a handful of solid scares, but beyond that, nothing else worked. The Lambert family was inexplicably sidelined for most of the film despite being in all of the trailers and marketing. Rose Byrne, who was my favorite character in number 1, might have been in only 3 or 4 scenes. It was such a waste to bring the entire cast back and not actually feature them. Beyond that, the film's script was just abysmal. I'm not normally a big plot holes guy, but holy shit, this movie was littered with them. Nothing about the ending made any sense. Everything related to Elaine and painting over the door felt completely half-assed and underthought. This film as a whole feels like a cash grab they farted out in 25 minutes rather than something that has been set up for over 10 years. Next up, at number 9, is The Pope's Exorcist. Two things can be true. The Pope's Exorcist is an objectively bad movie, and I enjoyed the hell out of it. The whole movie is hilarious, and I truly do not know how much of that is intentional. Russell Crowe has a House of Gucci level bad Italian accent throughout. It sounds like he's trying and failing to do a Mario impression for most of the movie. Crowe's character frequently rides around on a Vespa whistling at girls. The movie features the most obvious sequel bait ending I've ever seen, where after, spoiler alert, he defeats the demon, Italian Russell Crowe gets recruited to Exorcist Avengers in this giant HQ to fight demons all over the world. The more I talk about this movie, admittedly, the more I start to second guess its inclusion. I almost don't want to put this on my list, considering how much fun I had watching it. But I would be lying if I called this a good movie. So while The Pope's Exorcist may have been one of the 10 worst movies I've seen this year, at least it wasn't as boring as some of the others. Speaking of boring, next on my list, at number 8, is Exorcist Believer. I watched this a few weeks after its initial theatrical release, after the piles upon piles of negative reviews had already been put out. Maybe all these bad reviews lowered my expectations and influenced my viewing, but I really didn't hate this as much as I thought I would. It's still not a very good movie, it's still a totally unnecessary requel from a director who has a growing reputation of tainting the legacies of iconic horror franchises. But I thought Exorcist Believer still wasn't without its positives. The makeup effects were good, both child actors were good, Leslie Odom does a great job as the father, there are 3 standout moments from the exorcism that I thought were sufficiently shocking, and I enjoyed the ending. Sure, beyond that, this is a pretty drawn out, mostly uninteresting sequel. The decision to include Reagan and her mother felt like super forced fan service no one on earth was asking for or cared about. Exorcist Believer is underwhelming. It is not something I'd recommend to many people unless you're a huge fan of the exorcism subgenre. For the most part, it deserves the hate it's receiving, though, as you can tell from its placement, it is far from the worst movie I have seen this year. Getting closer to the worst, at number 7 is Killer Book Club. Saying Killer Book Club wears its references on its sleeves would be putting it lightly. This movie is very, very clearly just a straight ripoff of both Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. And I wanted to like it more than I did. I love slashers, I love whodunits, I love those 2 movies. I just wish this had even an ounce of originality to separate it from its influences. I wish instead of just blatantly copying those films, it took inspiration from them and created something new. It would not surprise me in the slightest if it was later revealed this entire film was written by a new Netflix AI, plugging in chase scenes and reveal scenes from other slashers, adding nothing of its own beyond a new dumb clown mask. Coming up next at number 6 is Malum. I'm honestly mad this movie even exists. Most remakes I understand to a degree. Either the original was a foreign film and the studio thinks American audiences don't want to read subtitles, or something that is decades old is remade to introduce to a new generation of potential fans. But Malum is an American remake of an American film that came out less than 10 years ago. That fact alone is stupid, but what's even worse is that Malum is worse than the original Last Shift in every way. Despite having a higher budget, the same director returning, and having the benefit of hindsight and the ability to correct any of the original's mistakes, Malum still stumbles over itself. Sure, the higher budget means a nicer set, better cameras, and more money for special effects, but what it gains in flash, it loses in substance. I like the grimier, unpolished looking original. The police station felt more isolated and claustrophobic. Now it feels like a set. This new film is not nearly as scary as the original. The atmosphere is completely lost and replaced with a pointless expanded story. None of the story changes are for the better. This turns from a simple, well-paced, straightforward story to a bloated and convoluted waste of time. This movie was truly the definition of if it isn't broke, don't fix it. I could not recommend Malum less. If you want to see a genuinely good, frightening, and underrated horror movie, just watch The Last Shift instead. Alright, now getting into my bottom 5. At number 5 is The Outwaters. In my top 10 video, I called Skinamarink the most divisive film of 2023. I said even though I loved it, I could see why many people didn't. And yet, despite Skinamarink and The Outwaters both being highly divisive films from this year that share a lot of similar elements, I have completely opposite opinions on them. I fucking hated watching The Outwaters. I had no fun. It was a painful experience. The Outwaters was a boring, ugly-looking, confusing, confused, nonsensical, low-budget mess. While Skinamarink's non-traditional, non-linear storytelling felt like it had a purpose, The Outwaters' quote-unquote story felt completely aimless. This felt like a film crew just went out into the desert with a flashlight and a camera and sprinted around for 2 hours making up a story on the fly. I still do not fully know what happened. I don't even know if there are answers, and honestly, I do not care at all to ever find out. At number 4 on my list is Children of the Corn. Children of the Corn was a lifeless film, a film that happens, you watch it, it ends, and you feel absolutely nothing. It's not even funny bad, it's just empty calories. It's a saltine cracker of a movie. Everything is so on the nose. They repeat the same obvious themes over and over. I don't know how many times a character told the main character, well, why don't you just move to the big city? Or mentioned how the adults screwed over the next generation. It's all just a lazy, half-baked metaphor, just stating facts without providing any interesting commentary. And I don't want to shit on child actors, it's not their fault, they're fucking 10 years old, their parents signed them up for this. But it does go without saying, it's really hard to carry a movie when all of the main characters are child actors. It's hard for the main antagonist to deliver chilling, impactful lines of dialogue when they're a 4th grader. As well, the special effects in Children of the Corn look like utter crap. Just the worst looking CGI blood and wounds you'll ever see. Spoiler alert, the corn monster that appears at the end looks horrendous. I'd obviously never recommend anyone should watch this, but if nothing else, if you are curious, find Children of the Corn on a free streaming service, fast forward to the end, and take a look at the monster for yourself. And hey, while you're there, watch the final 20 seconds of this movie. It will tell you everything you need to know about how bad this movie truly is. Getting to my bottom 3, at number 3 is The Nun 2. I am very happy to say The Nun 2 is the last Nun film I will ever have the displeasure of watching. I have wasted too many hours of my life watching The Nun and discussing The Nun. After this video, I swear, I will waste no more time thinking or talking about this franchise. I hate it. I despise it. As a horror fan, the fact that both of these movies were among the highest grossing horror films from their respective years makes me so sad. Both movies have been mind-numbingly boring and a complete waste of my time. They lack everything that make the other Conjuring films work. They lack heart. They lack interesting or charismatic leads like the Warrens. They lack creativity. There are maybe a handful of decent scares in each, but still, as a whole, they're underwhelming in that department too. It's ironic these two films center around faith, considering how completely soulless they both are. Alright, at number 2, my runner-up is Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. I knew this movie looked awful, I heard from the reviews it was awful, and yet despite that, I was still underwhelmed when I saw it. I mean, where do I even begin? The animals look so fucking bad. Even with the explanation that they're half-human hybrids, it's so clearly just men wearing Halloween masks. The film is poorly made, it's ugly, its lack of budget shows, and for a movie with such a stupid premise, it's surprisingly really mean-spirited. You would have thought this movie would have been more tongue-in-cheek, similar in tone to something like Terrifier, aware of its absurdity and its stupidity. But instead, Winnie the Pooh takes itself way too seriously and is at times hard to watch. I am certainly not opposed to blood, gore, and guts, but for example, you see someone's wife get choked to death with a metal chain by Piglet, and they burn her body, and tie up the husband, and whip him in the back for minutes until he scars, and then show him the burnt carcass of his wife, and then smear her blood all over his face as he cries. It's just not fun, it's just an unpleasant watch. There's no stories, the actors are terrible, it's not funny, it's not scary. I absolutely hate this new trend of making rated R horror adaptations of children's stories. And no, not because I think the Winnie the Pooh story is sacred, I really could give less of a shit about that. I just hate how half-assed these movies are. The filmmakers clearly think just because they got a recognizable IP and created internet buzz from the movie's mere existence, they don't need to put any effort into the film itself. Based on the fact that Blood and Honey made $5 million, these filmmakers are sadly correct. They can keep farting out these lazy, terrible movies, and they'll keep getting free advertising from outraged fans and news outlets. Any other year, Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey would have been my least favorite. However, I'll instead consider it a very, very close number 2. As a positive, it does have a handful of good effects and effective kills. Plus, it at least gets a slight pass for being so low budget. As much as I really don't like it, I can't fully fault a filmmaker trying to make a name for himself with limited resources. However, the next film on my list does not have the same excuse. At number 1, my least favorite horror film from 2023 was Five Nights at Freddy's. Not only was Five Nights at Freddy's the worst horror movie I've seen this year, it was quite possibly the worst theater experience I have ever had in my entire life. The theater was sold out and packed to the brim with 10-year-olds and overly eager adults talking non-stop about game lore to the parent or unenthused girlfriend they dragged along. I have nothing positive to say about this movie. The script was hacky and cliche, the dialogue was shit, the cop character and her motivations constantly flipped, the story was all over the place. I would not be shocked in the slightest to learn this had major reshoots or a major re-edit. Worst of all, Five Nights was not the slightest bit scary. For a franchise solely built around jump scares, this had a shocking lack of them. We spent most of the movie outside the fucking restaurant in a mall or in a diner or in pointless dream sequences in a forest. I honestly cannot believe this movie fucked up what should have been its bread and butter. I can understand and accept Five Nights having a shit story, but I could not believe it didn't even have a couple of good scares. Fucking just put the main character at the security desk, have animatronics move across the screen, have him navigate the scary building, build up suspense, and build to some fucking jump scares. Rinse and repeat. I don't know all the lore, I do not care, but I've played enough of the games to know that is what this movie should have been. A cheap, fun, stupid jump scare fest. Just fucking copy the formula already laid out in the games. I have no idea why this wanted to reinvent the wheel. It was maddening. I was bored out of my mind. I'm aware I am not the target demographic. This movie wasn't made for me. All the people who it was made for, they all seem to enjoy it. The theater clapped at the end like it was Endgame, and genuinely good for them. For as angry as I sound, if this fulfilled a childhood dream for you, I'm happy. If this movie is a gateway for kids to get into horror, I'm also happy. But even with that considered, I'm not gonna sit here and lie. I am not extremely biased like the fans. This is still an undeniably terrible fucking movie. I am certain the people that gave this positive reviews had already decided they liked it before the opening credits rolled. This could have been 89 minutes of a blank screen, and as long as it had a MatPat cameo, fans were gonna give it a thumbs up. This placement may piss some people off, but I am so confident in saying Five Nights at Freddy's is without a doubt the worst horror movie I saw in 2023. Alright, and now that the rants are over, those, in my opinion, are the 10 worst horror movies I saw in 2023. Please in the comments below, let me know what was the worst horror movie you had the misfortune of seeing this year. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel, Horror Flicks with Nick. Once a week, I post early horror reviews, horror lists, commentaries, deep dives, and 2-minute recommendations for underrated horror movies you can stream on Netflix, Prime, and Shudder. Thank you all for watching my bottom 10 list. Make sure to also check out my top 10 video as well. Also, since this is the last video I'll post before the 25th, I hope all of you have an awesome Christmas. I'll see you all in the new year.